Welcome back. Tonight, we travel once again into the darker corners of Japan, where old legends linger beneath the sound of cicadas, and some stories are better left untold. This one is called Kunekune, a story about what happens when curiosity meets something that was never meant to be seen. That year was the first time I truly remembered what summer smelled like, the scent of soil, straw, and the hot breath of wind. When we returned from the city to my grandmother's house in Akita, the sunlight was so bright it almost hurt. The distant mountains trembled in the heat haze, and the air shimmered like water. Everything was too quiet, wrapped in the endless cry of cicadas. It felt as if the whole world had stopped breathing, leaving only the sound of the insects and the weight of the heat pressing down on my chest. Every year during the Bon festival, my parents took my brother and me back to that wooden house at the edge of the village. In front of it stretched a wide green field of rice, moving like a sea whenever the wind passed. We ran out as soon as we arrived, barefoot on the warm soil. My brother, a few years older, always led the way. He loved the countryside, said it was real air, real ground. I just followed, sweating and laughing, dizzy from the sun. But that afternoon, something changed. The wind suddenly stopped, and the air turned thick and heavy. The smell of wet earth filled my nose. My brother lifted his head, staring into the distance. I followed his gaze. Far beyond the rippling rice, there was a patch of white. At first, I thought it was laundry or maybe a scarecrow, but then I noticed it was moving. The rice was still, yet that white thing swayed back and forth, slow and steady. We stood there for a long time, watching. The cicadas screamed louder, their sound drilling into my ears. The white shadow moved like something alive, soft, unsteady, almost human. A strange uneasiness crept through me, but I couldn't look away. It was as if the whole landscape was holding its breath, hiding something it didn't want us to see. That summer afternoon began quietly, but I didn't know then. It would be the last time I ever saw my brother as himself. The next few days were just as hot. The sunlight burned through the thin curtains, and the air smelled of rice and damp straw. My brother and I kept returning to the same spot by the fields, drawn by something we couldn't explain. The white figure was always there. It never came closer, never disappeared. It just kept swaying endlessly, like time itself had stopped around it. Sometimes, a breeze would come down from the mountains, making the whole field ripple like waves. But the white thing didn't follow the wind. Its motion had its own rhythm, slow, twisting, almost graceful, but wrong. It felt too human. I couldn't stop watching. Beside me, my brother grew more serious each day, his expression tight, his breathing shallow. Then one afternoon, the light dimmed as clouds gathered above the hills. The wind died completely. The rice froze still. The cicadas fell silent. Only that white shape continued to move. Without wind, it shouldn't have been able to sway, but it did, bending unnaturally, its body twisting in strange angles. I thought I heard a faint sound, something wet and scraping, coming from far away. My brother's shoulders tensed. He suddenly turned and ran back to the house. Before I understood what was happening, he came running out again, clutching an old pair of binoculars. His face was pale. He didn't say a word. He lifted the binoculars and looked through them. Everything went silent again. Even the heat seemed to stop. After a few seconds, his hands started shaking. His eyes widened, his face drained of color. Sweat rolled down his forehead as he took a step back. The binoculars slipped from his hands and hit the ground with a dull, hollow sound. His lips moved, but no words came out. Then a sudden gust of hot wind blew across the field, yet the air felt colder than ever. I didn't dare move. The world around me seemed to hold its breath. The white shadow was still there, still twisting, now faster, more violently. I glanced at my brother again, and for the first time, I saw something missing from his eyes. The person standing beside me no longer felt like my brother. The moment my brother dropped the binoculars, everything around me seemed to stop. He stood there, his back toward me, shoulders trembling slightly. A thin beam of sunlight slipped through the clouds and fell on him, lighting his body like an empty shell. I wanted to call out, but my throat refused to move. Far away, the white figure kept swaying, its rhythm strange, almost deliberate, as if it were mocking us. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe just a few seconds. Then my brother slowly turned around. His face was pale as paper, his eyes unfocused, and sweat streamed down his temples. His lips twitched like he wanted to smile, but couldn't. He looked hollow. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward the house, his steps slow and uneven, like his legs didn't belong to him anymore. I felt a deep chill spread through me. The binoculars lay on the ground, glinting in the sun, the glass reflecting sharp, painful light. For a long time, I just stared at it. Something inside me whispered that I shouldn't touch it, but curiosity was stronger. I reached down. The metal was cold against my fingertips, and then I heard it, footsteps pounding through the dirt. I looked up. Grandfather was running toward me from across the field. His white hair shone in the sunlight, his face twisted with fear I had never seen before. His clothes were soaked with sweat. He was shouting something, waving his arms, but the wind and the cicadas drowned his voice. I could only see his mouth moving, his eyes wide with panic. He reached me, grabbed my wrist, and slapped the binoculars out of my hand. The shock of it made my fingers sting. He was breathing hard, his whole body shaking. He stared at me, eyes searching, terrified. I could tell he was asking if I had seen it. I shook my head. Then his knees gave out, and he sank to the ground, tears welling up in his eyes. The sight of my grandfather crying made my stomach twist. I stood there frozen as the wind returned, carrying the smell of wet straw and earth. When I finally looked back toward the field, the white figure was gone. The space where it had been looked the same as before, but something in the air had changed. It was thicker, heavier. Even the sound of the cicadas felt muffled, like they were far away. From that day on, I never touched a pair of binoculars again. That evening, darkness fell quickly. Clouds gathered low over the rooftops, and the air turned gray, heavy with rain that never came. Grandfather and I walked home without speaking. When we reached the house, I could already hear the sound of someone crying. My mother's sobs echoed faintly through the hallway, and the whole place smelled of incense and fear. I didn't understand what had happened yet, but everyone's faces were pale. In the center of the living room, my brother sat motionless. His head was lowered, his hands resting on his knees, hair messy, clothes wrinkled. For a moment, he looked like he was asleep. But then I noticed the small movement, a faint, steady rocking of his body. The same rhythm, the same motion as the white figure in the field. My grandmother stood in the corner, clutching her prayer beads, lips trembling silently. My father sat on the floor, his head buried in his hands. My mother was beside him, shaking, afraid to look. Nobody moved closer. My brother's slow swaying filled the room with a soundless tension. It wasn't natural, it wasn't human. His body seemed to remember something the rest of him had forgotten. The smell of damp tatami and old cloth hung in the air, mixed with something faintly sweet and rotten. I heard my grandmother whisper something under her breath, words I couldn't understand, but I caught one phrase. "Let him stay here." Grandfather didn't answer. He just wiped his face with a trembling hand and stared at the floor. His silence said more than any words could. He knew what had happened. He knew it couldn't be undone. Then my brother raised his head. His eyes were wide and empty, and there was a strange, stiff smile on his lips. It wasn't a human smile. It looked painted on, pulled tight by invisible hands. He began to move again, slowly twisting his upper body, imitating that same motion from the fields. Watching him made my skin crawl. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall. For a moment, he looked straight at me, and I felt something cold climb from my feet to my throat. The brother who once laughed and ran with me through the rice fields was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The crying in the house faded in and out, sometimes near, sometimes far, like waves. Between the silences, I could still hear that faint sound, the slow, dry rubbing of fabric against the floor. The sound of something still moving in the dark. It never stopped. A few days later, the weather suddenly turned cool. Morning mist covered the village like a veil, hiding the mountains in pale white smoke. The house felt quieter than ever. The adults whispered to each other, their eyes avoiding mine. At breakfast, One seat at the table remained empty. It was my brother's. He never stepped out of his room again. Food was left outside his door, but no one knew if he touched it. Sometimes at night, I could hear faint sounds from inside, slow breathing, the soft rustle of fabric, and once in a while a dry cracking noise like something bending the wrong way. No one spoke of it. Even my grandmother had stopped praying. She sat by the window all day, staring into the fields, her eyes dull and far away. On the morning we left, the sky was gray and wet. My mother packed quietly. My father said nothing. Grandfather stood by the door looking older, his face lined with deep shadows. I heard him murmur something to my parents, words I couldn't catch, until the last sentence drifted through the air. Let him stay. My stomach dropped. I didn't understand why, but I knew what it meant. They were leaving my brother behind. My chest tightened as we stepped outside. The air smelled of rain and soil. My grandmother bowed slightly, her face calm, almost peaceful. It was the kind of expression you see at funerals, not farewells. As we drove away, I turned to look back one last time. The house grew smaller, swallowed by the mist. The fields stretched endlessly behind it, waves of green swaying under the dull sky. Then I saw it, something white standing beside the house. It moved slowly, rhythmically, like it was waving. My hands trembled as I grabbed the binoculars from the seat beside me. Through the lens, I saw my brother. He was smiling. His clothes were white, his posture calm, his eyes soft. For a moment, I thought he looked peaceful. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. His movements were stiff, mechanical, his smile frozen in place. He wasn't waving. He was swaying. The same motion, the same rhythm as that figure in the fields. I lowered the binoculars, and tears blurred my vision. The car turned a corner, and the house disappeared behind the rice. The smell of damp air filled the car, heavy and cold. That scent stayed with me for years. I thought he was sick. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew the truth. The day we left Akita, we weren't just leaving home. We were leaving him behind. Time passed quickly. Many summers came and went. I grew up, moved to the city, found work, and learned to live like everyone else. The memories of that summer in Akita faded into the corners of my mind, tucked away like an old box I never dared to open. Yet every year, when the air turned thick and the cicadas began to sing, those memories returned. The sound, the heat, the smell of the rice fields, they all came back, along with that faint image of something white swaying far away. I never went back. My parents rarely spoke of it. They told me my grandmother had passed away, and that grandfather was sick. I only nodded. Sometimes in dreams, I saw the old house again. The wooden walls, the dark hallway, and beyond the window, something moving slowly in the fields. In those dreams, I could always hear my brother laughing somewhere behind me, softly, distantly, like wind brushing through the grass. I knew it wasn't memory. It was something that had never really left. In the years that followed, people kept talking about the white figure. Different towns, different times, yet the stories all sounded the same. A pale shape moving in the fields, where the air is heavy and the cicadas never stop. Some say it's a god. Others say it's a curse. One belief goes back to an old custom from long ago. In times of famine, villagers would sometimes leave behind those who could no longer work, the sick, the weak, the old. They were tied to wooden frames and covered in white cloth, placed in the rice fields like scarecrows. From a distance, their white clothes would twist in the wind, and people said it looked like they were praying. When they died, their bodies were left there, and over time, their souls became part of the land. The villagers began to treat them as guardians of the harvest, spirits of the fields. Some believe the white figures are what remain of those souls, still wandering the countryside, forever swaying in the same rhythm as the wind that once carried their final breath. Another explanation is far darker. In ancient times, there were people who practiced forbidden rituals, those who tried to control unseen forces. They summoned spirits to do their bidding, but when they died, the spirits were left behind, trapped between worlds with no purpose. Those who claim to have seen the white figure say it moves like something that once tried to imitate a human, but forgot how. It bends the wrong way, moves too slowly, as if the body remembers something the spirit does not. Whether a forgotten god or a restless curse, one thing never changes. Those who see it are never the same again. Maybe that's why the old people said, don't look too long, don't try to understand. Once you see something that doesn't belong in this world, you can never truly look away. Some things are meant to fade quietly into the summer haze. And somewhere, beneath the gray sky and the still fields, something white still moves, slow, silent, endless, waiting to be seen again.